And now we come to our keynote speaker, who is somebody who brought you the ice cream tonight. Ben Cohen, you know, is a New Yorker. He pretends he is from Vermont, but he really is from Merrick, Long Island. And let's hear it for the Long Islanders in the house here that we can claim Ben. I grew up right next door in Freeport. Ben moved to Vermont, met Jerry, started making ice cream, found that people liked it, made more and more and more ice cream, found that people really liked it, and turned it into this major Ben & Jerry company that became a very, very multi-hundred-million-dollar company. Ben did not want to sell the company to Unilever, fought hard to stop that from happening, but despite his efforts, it did happen. Ben could have taken his money and gone to retire on some beautiful island that probably would be sunk very soon, but he didn't do that. Instead, he did things like join all kinds of boards, Social Venture Network, Hampshire College, Oxfam, Greenpeace, Business for Social Responsibility, Heifer International, Alter Eco. But he also created another company where he made himself the president and head stamper, and this is the stamp Stampede. And some of you might actually have gotten money that has been stamped by Ben and the stampers that say things like, not to be used for bribing politicians. Ben realized early on that one of the real evils of our system was the corruption of money in politics. And I was looking for an anecdote. I'm a dear friend of Ben's, and I had a lot of anecdotes, and I started looking at one, and I found this one that was just so amazing, which is an ad that he put out right before 9/11. In fact, it was September 4th. The week before the 9/11 attack. And that ad said, enemy wanted. Serious enemy needed to justify Pentagon budget increase. Defense contractors desperate. Interested enemies send letter and photo to enemy search committee. He went on to say that the Bush administration was proposing to increase the Pentagon budget to larger than it ever was before, but that even though these very creative lobbyists had spent $50 million a year trying to justify that increase, he wrote in this ad, our politicians do not possess the creativity to find the right adversary. My enemy search, if successful, would go a long way towards easing the consciousness of our politicians who support the fat Pentagon budget, which diverts money from poor children, the environment, and other good things. So you can see that Ben is a prankster. Ben uses not just his resources, but his creativity, his humor, his fun spirit, his passion, his ice cream to try to address the evils of our society, but he does it in such a very, very, very sweet way. We love you, Ben. Thank you. Come and tell us what we'd like to hear from you.
Well, thanks very much. It's amazing to be here with so many of my heroes and friends and heroines, both here with us in the flesh and in spirit. You know, it was amazing seeing that slideshow of all the things that Peace Action has been doing all through the years. You guys are so delightfully in your face, and you are shit off the hook, let me tell you. And then you come to that big photo of me wearing exactly what I'm wearing tonight. I want to tell you that I did wash it before I came here today. I also am a real admirer of Emma Goldman, who said, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." So I really want to hand it to the band. Peace Action has this incredibly long and proud history. It's led massive movements, and it's remained stalwart in its resistance to the use of violence and weapons of mass destruction to solve problems. And so I'm honored to be here. And I'm especially honored to be here at the very place that Martin Luther King delivered his Beyond Vietnam speech, because he's a man whose actions and words have inspired much of my life. We condemn violence, particularly the violence of war, because it kills and maims people, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. And to add to the pain, our government does it in our name and with our money. It was Elie Wiesel who said that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. So I want to thank everyone here for not accepting, for not giving up, for being the true lovers. I want to talk about a few things that have come into focus for me as I continue to do this work. For what it's worth, call them the 6 revelations of Ben. First, I believe that our struggle is not just about war, but how we use our money. It's about economic violence. In 1976, the Vatican put out a statement that said, even when they are not used, by their cost alone, armaments kill the poor by causing them to starve. And it was Martin Luther King, in discussing what led him to give that very speech we've been talking about in this very place. He said, "I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic sucking tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such." In the business and financial world, this is known as opportunity cost. If I expend resources on doing one thing, the opportunity cost is what I forego as a result of that decision. In the business world, decisions tend to be made somewhat more rationally. In the political world, decisions too often are made based on fear, bribery, electoral expediency, and spin. So, what is the opportunity cost? What else could we do with some of the resources that are currently spent on national security? Well, first, let's see how much we spend on national security, and there's the bar. The first part, that blue part, And I want you to know, I understand that this is a dinner and a celebration and it's kind of late and we've all had something to drink. You know, I don't expect you to look at numbers. If you see any numbers on these charts, just kind of fuzz them out, because I just want you to look at the colors and see the proportions. So this is the actual national security budget. The blue is the Pentagon base budget. That's 600 some odd billion dollars. And then the green is the overseas contingency budget, the extra money that we spend for wars. And between the two of them, with Trump's recent increase, that's about $700 billion. But then if you add in the Veterans Administration costs and the care for our veterans, and you add in the interest on the national debt for the military portion of that debt, and then if you add in retirement benefits for our soldiers, and then if you add in the cost of Homeland Security, and then the Department of Energy, which does the nuclear weapons, and then other sort of defense stuff, you get up to over $1 trillion, which is the real national security budget. Well, what's the opportunity cost in relationship to that? Well, we could provide college for all, free college for all. We could rescind the cuts on the food stamps. We could provide over 1 million jobs for disadvantaged youth, and we could fully fund Head Start for just 10% of that budget over there. And the second revelation is that we need to focus on the big picture. And the big picture is money. You know, the average American will never understand whether a particular weapon system is needed or not, whether the price tag is reasonable or not. These are complex issues, and for someone who doesn't have the time or inclination to study this stuff, after dealing with the kids, the leaky roof, trying to earn a living, keeping their economic head above water, paying the credit card bills, etc., the average American has no choice but to trust the experts, the generals and admirals with all the medals on their uniforms, people who have risen to the top of the Pentagon bureaucracy, one of whose requirements is fealty to that bureaucracy. But even so, even though the deck is stacked so heavily against us, every once in a while, through a humongous and heroic effort, we win one, and a weapon system is canceled. What this usually means is that we end up buying a whole lot less of them for a whole lot more money per unit. But under no circumstances is the Pentagon budget ever cut. Any money saved is just transferred to another Pentagon budget line, and the economic violence continues unabated. So instead of weapon systems, let's focus on money. That's what politicians do. They don't talk about the intricacies of this or that weapon system. They talk about money. I'm going to spend more money on defense than my opponent. Therefore, my opponent is weak on defense, and I will protect you. And it becomes a bidding war. As long as the public believes that more defense spending equals more security, we will never reduce the amount of money spent on the Pentagon. In fact, it will continue to increase. But people also have an understanding of budgets, because they manage their own household budgets. And they understand that if you spend money on one thing, you can't spend it on something else. So the third revelation is that we need to inoculate people from this we're being outspent, hollowed out military, weak on defense bullshit. So how can we do that? There's two charts that are really easy to understand. We can focus on them, make them ubiquitous, and you can focus on them consistently for the next decade. We can do that because the stuff really doesn't change that much from year to year. We don't have to gear up for a new fight. We just keep hammering away at the same info day in, day out. Because armed with the information on these charts, the public will not accept that level of Pentagon spending, and we've got the polling numbers to prove it. So, if this thing works, I don't know where I'm supposed to point it. I'm clicking. Maybe somebody else can make it move. Oh, there. So this is a chart that shows military expenditures for the top 15 countries in the world. The very top line is the US, and you can see it go down. There's China, Russia, and then most of the rest of them are all our allies. But in comparison to the US, even at the base Pentagon budget, it's totally out of whack. And here's the second chart. This is the discretionary federal budget, how much money Congress allocates every year. And the big blue half of the chart is the Pentagon budget. And things like education, veterans benefits, transportation, health, community development, they get all those little slices. The key is to present stuff in ways that people can understand it. And that means no more talk about billions, because human beings can't conceive of large numbers like that. 100 million is the same as 500 million, is the same as a billion, is the same as 100 billion. They're all the same. They're all huge numbers, more than you can imagine. Let's take an example. If you ask most people, why are we spending money on the Pentagon today? They'll probably say to protect us from terrorism. Well, here's what all the terrorist groups put together spend. Total terrorist spending. There's ISIS on the bottom, some other one, Humus, FARC, Hezbollah, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, you name them, it adds up to $5 billion. And here's what it looks like if you put it into perspective. There's the base Pentagon budget, the big blue thing, and down there in the lower left, I don't know if you can see it, is the $5 billion that we're supposedly spending that money to defend ourselves against. We need to communicate visually and comparatively so that a huge amount is in context. And the fourth revelation, maybe it came a little late to me, is that war is terrorism. Bombing is terrorism. Attack drones are terrorism. And we are creating enemies faster than we can kill them. You know, the estimated number of Iraqis killed just this year alone exceeds 12,000. 12,000 people. How many of us would become fighters if some country killed our son or our daughter or wife or husband? Well, maybe we're all peacenists and pacifists here, but how many of us know somebody who would? You know, 20-year-olds have grown up in an environment where we've been at war every day of their lives. It's normal. If we don't change our direction, we're likely to end up where we're headed. Endless war. It was Albert Einstein who said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. He went on to say that you cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war. The very prevention of war requires more faith, courage, and resolution than are needed to prepare for war. And it was Martin Luther King who said that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And even former President George W. Bush linked poverty and terrorism, saying that we fight against poverty because hope is an answer to terror. I guess he kind of got the idea, he just didn't put his money where his mouth is. So why not fight the root cause instead of the symptom? It happens to be less expensive, and it happens to be morally right. This next slide is a chart of foreign aid. The countries that spend the most on foreign aid, as a percentage of their gross national product. As you can see, Sweden, headed by our dear ambassador here, is the top. And as you can also see, the United States isn't even on the list. You know, a bunch of years ago, all the members of the UN agreed that they would all contribute at least 0.7% of their gross national product to humanitarian foreign aid. What the US currently spends on its humanitarian foreign aid is 0.17%, about 1/3 of the last line on the chart. In the early 1960s, the United States donated over 0.5% of its GNP to poor nations. You know, I happen to have just come from Sweden, the country that devotes the highest proportion. And let me tell you, their economy is rocking. And another thing about Sweden, if you're not squandering over half your expendable income on preparing to kill people in other countries, you've got enough money available to provide universal health care, highly subsidized child care and elder care, provide 480 days of parental leave, free college tuition, and reduce poverty to half the level of the United States. Well, the fifth revelation is on issues of war, who do people trust? Us hippies and peaceniks, or majors, generals, and warriors? The messenger matters. We civilians in the peace movement will never have the credibility needed to effectively question, no less counter, the Pentagon's message until we are successful in getting true patriots from the national security establishment, retired generals, admirals, colonels, security and intelligence experts, to carry the message that when it comes to the global war on terror, we are creating enemies faster than we can kill them, and that more billions spent on the Pentagon do not buy us more security. It's the messenger that counts. Without these credentialed experts, we'll continue to be dismissed as just a bunch of starry-eyed peaceniks. We in the movement for lasting nonviolent peace need to devote resources to nurturing and supporting high-level military officers who agree with us and need a job when they return from active duty. The venerable Center for Defense Information is now being revitalized under the umbrella of the Project on Government Oversight. 15 retired high-level military officers, many at CDI, are now using their credibility to fight alongside us for a more just and peaceful world. And we need to work together with unlikely bedfellows. Some of the strongest allies we have on the issue of Pentagon spending are Cato, the libertarian think tank, and some conservative Republicans. It doesn't matter if we don't agree with them on a bunch of other stuff. Let's focus on stuff we agree on. And now for the intro to the sixth and final revelation. We live in a militarized society. We have militarized police forces, militarized Super Bowl flyovers, militarized soldiers board first airlines, militarized curriculum and recruitment at our schools, militarized statues at our parks and public squares. And we have a religious establishment that condones the militarization. This is what it looks like in chart form. Oh, there it is. Some people think it looks like someone's giving you the finger. But the middle bar is the Pentagon, topped off by the Pentagon extras, topped off by how much our allies are spending on their militaries. And to the right, you see what China spends, what Russia spends, what North Korea spends, and then what the terrorists spend. And to the left, you see how much the U.S. spends on education at the federal level, how much we spend on housing and community, how much on energy and environment, and how much on humanitarian foreign aid. That's the information. It's pretty much the same as the information on those pens that you got on your tables there. The pens are a little out of date, but the proportions are about the same. So thank you for helping me clear out my office of these materials, but they are the very last, so they're also collector's items and could be the source of your children's college education fund. But that was the introduction to the sixth point, and the sixth point is that we need to build political power. And it's not lobbying Congress because we're woefully outspent. Over the last 20 years, military contractors have spent $2 billion lobbying members of Congress and $500 million essentially bribing our Congress people with campaign donations. And it's not about writing papers and analysis and trying to prove we're right. It's not about who's right. It's about a revolution of values. It's about hate and greed and fear versus love and generosity and tolerance. As Martin Luther King said, a true revolution of values will lay a hand on the world order and say, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues, year after year, to spend more money on military defense than on programs of spiritual uplift is approaching spiritual death. Today, it's about Reverend Barber's fusion politics, He's the guy who led the Moral Mondays protest movements in North Carolina. He's the guy who has started a fusion politics, which is based on Paul Hawken's analysis that showed that we who share these values represent the largest movement ever, but that we are currently segmented into environmentalists, peace activists, gender activists, racial equality activists, etc. Reverend Barber brought them all together in North Carolina, and now he's doing it nationally as the leader of the new Poor People's Campaign, which continues what Martin Luther King was working on toward the end of his life. The Poor People's Campaign will be publicly launched this spring and is currently recruiting organizational allies. It's about working electorally with Our Revolution and Democracy for America to build political power in down-ballot races. And we'll never win if our votes don't count. So it's about, well, you know, what it's about is stamping money out of politics and stopping the attack on voting rights. I suppose there will always be injustice, but it is in working to end injustice that we find our soul, our spirit, and our joy. So let us continue to work together, because our country, the last remaining superpower on earth, needs to learn to measure its strength not in terms of how many people we can kill, but in terms of how many people we can feed, clothe, house, and care for. Thank you.